text me. All right? Okay, bye-bye.
Hi. We're going to start in about 1 second. I see a tech person in the back who's just plugging in something that needs to be plugged in. So thanks for your patience and give us about 60 seconds. Okay, well, as David Goodman figures out how to record the more important people, I'll give an introduction. I'm less important than everybody else in the room, including you, the students and staff and faculty and visitors to UMass Boston. I want to thank you for attending this forum on increasing federal and state investment in higher education. And I want to thank all of the co-sponsors who made it possible, especially the people here who are on campus and on other campuses in the public higher ed system. So PHENOM, which is the Public Education Network of Massachusetts. Save UMass Boston. The Faculty, Staff, and Union Executive Committee, the William Joyner Center, which is luckily still around. I also want to thank the Institute for People's Engagement, Mass Peace Action. These are all co-sponsors of the event. American Friends Service Committee, National Our Revolution Somerville, the People's Budget Campaign, SEIU 888, and Veterans for Peace. We've got two packed panels who are going to share with us their analyses and viewpoints, and they will then engage in discussion with each other and with you, our audience. And during and between the panels, go on and grab a snack if you need one, because I think we'll need reinforcements, what with all the information and analysis we're going to get here today. My name is Jane Regan, and I actually used to teach here at UMass at a place that doesn't exist anymore, I guess, the College of Public and Community Service. So that was a great school. Now I teach at Boston University, and one of the things I study is community media and radical and alternative media. I've worked all over New England, and I've also worked all over the world. And before I give the mic to our panelists, I want to say something that involves the context here at UMass, and indeed it is something that is happening around the country and all over the world. And this, as we are now in our fourth decade of trudging through something that is called neoliberalism. Has anyone ever heard the phrase TINA, T-I-N-A? Well, it was Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I think it was Maggie Thatcher who made it popular, meaning there is no alternative. This is the way we do capitalism. This is the way we do public policy. And it basically means neoliberalism version of capitalism is what we're going to live, what we're going to breathe, and what a lot of us are going to die. And it's basically an ideology and a set of policies, social and political, that value capital, the production and consolidation of it, over people and the production and consolidation of human beings. And of course, that's what higher education is all about, right? Helping to produce and consolidate and build strong people that will then build strong communities. So basically, neoliberalism in this context means take away state funding for things like social services and healthcare and education. Let's let the market solve our problems. And so that has been happening not just at UMass and state schools, but also at private colleges and universities. And they're all chasing dollars and trying to get people to lend their name and name buildings after them and have grants and corporate sponsorships. And what happens is education, professors, syllabi, students, we're all being impacted in so many ways, not just higher tuitions, but also the classrooms are changing and engagement is changing on campus. But we've got here a room full of engaged people, so we're quite lucky. The reason that I'm here, because I'm not from UMass, is because those of us fighting against these kinds of changes in our country, in our communities, we recognize that both public and private higher education institutions are all under the gun. And so that's why we've brought together faculty and staff from Boston area, private and public universities. So I'll end by just saying that I am a contingent laborer, just like the adjunct professors here. I used to be contingent at Salem State, where I worked on a year-by-year basis, and then that money ran out. Now I'm contingent at BU. So I'm in my 4th year of not being able to plan my life more than basically a couple of semesters at a time. So I think that our panel here is going to have some ideas of why this is happening and more importantly, what we can all do to contribute to a big fight against it. And so I want to start by introducing Barbara Mataloni. She is the former president of the Mass Teachers Association, and she's now the education coordinator of Labor Notes. She will be followed by State Rep Mike Conley. He represents part of Somerville and Cambridge. He's an attorney and an organizer. He's right here to my right, and he grew up in public housing. He's in his first term, running for re-election right now, I believe? Yes. And a member of Democratic Socialists of America. He lives in Cambridge. We've got Professor Tony Vandermeer from right here at UMass. We're lucky enough to have him join us, senior lecturer in Africana Studies, and former chairman of the Black Political Task Force here in Boston. Followed by Jonathan King, professor from MIT, who's right almost at the end, next to Paul Atwood, who's on the end. And he is the the vice chair of Mass Peace Action, chair of Our Revolution National Campus Faculty and Staff Committee. And then Steve Atwood at the end, senior lecturer in American Studies. He teaches at UMass Boston Honors College, and he is a member of Veterans for Peace and a prolific author. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I don't know if Barbara's going to come up here, or should I bring the mic over there?
Okay, all right, thank you. Not that I'll listen to you, but I just like to know that there's someone out there I'm not paying attention to. No, I will keep to my time. So thanks very much, Jane, and thank you all for being here. I just want to say a couple things. By way of introduction, I am the former president of the Mass Teachers Association, but I'm here and I'm going to speak to the work that the MTA is actually doing now under the new leadership, Mary Najimy, who is the president, and Max Page, who is the vice president. What I'm about to tell you about in terms of the work that we're doing for public higher education, pre-K through higher ed, is deeply and firmly rooted in the vision that Mary and Max bring to the MTA. As well, I just really have to acknowledge that, like nationally, there are demonstrations starting at 4 o'clock, I guess. I'm not sure who's organizing those for people to walk out of whatever they are doing relative to the Kavanaugh confirmation, which is looking more and more inevitable. So I'm just really pissed off. And if you know me, that's not like a new state of affairs, particularly just sort of a heightened one at this moment. But I think also very much, if we look at what's happening with the Supreme Court and Kavanaugh's confirmation, like if it hasn't been clear enough to enough of us for long enough, the ruling class doesn't care about us at all. They're not interested in the things that we're interested in. And as we gather today to talk to each other about how we can organize to protect, preserve, and enhance education, in particular public higher education, we have to understand where the lines are drawn. Secretary of Education Pizer, the Secretary of Education here in Massachusetts, just a few years ago at the convocation here at UMass Boston, said that UMass Boston didn't need any more money, and all that we needed to do was tighten our belts and become more efficient. There is a coldness and a calculatedness that exists in people in power that I think we need to recognize, and the Kavanaugh hearings are bringing home to us in a profound way, and know that as we think about how we're going to build the relationships and the trust and the organizing capacity to win the schools and colleges that we all deserve and communities that we deserve. And actually that's a significant part of the MTA work that they're doing, in particular on public higher education. And to go back to Tina, there is no alternative. I think that it's really important to start there. The first piece of the MTA campaign to fully fund our future, as they're calling it, is to raise expectations. And we have for so long, under the neoliberal regime, the neoliberal version of capitalism, under capitalism I would say, accustomed ourselves to accepting the world as it is, rather than the world as we know in our hearts it should be, the things that we really value. And I think it's really critical that we start in a place where we refuse their demand for accommodations, we refuse their insistence on austerity and scarcity, that we understand that austerity, as Max Page, the vice president of MTA, says, it's a strategy and a choice. It's deliberate. And it is done to undermine public education so that it loses its value, and in losing its value can then be taken over by private interests, and those private interests will extract value from it until it collapses or just serves, or education just serves the 1%. So it's really critical, and having been MTA president, sat in thousands of meetings, it feels like, where people tried to say to me, Barbara, what are we going to do? There's just no money. We have to refuse that. There is money. The issue is who has it and whose money it actually is, because it's our money. It's the money that was produced by working people. So we have to, and we're going to have to help each other with that, because, thank you, room after room you're going to sit in, and people are going to explain to you how unreasonable you are to think that more is possible. In particular, 1 minute left. In particular, MTA is saying that we demand fully funded public higher ed back to the 2001 per student ratios, which would take about $574 million. That's not a lot of money, but that's the kind of thing that we need to expect and demand, and that's what MTA is working on to do. But as well as raising expectations, and this goes to my earlier point, we need to raise hell. Because they're not going to give it to us if we're polite. And they're not going to give it to us until we really get out on the streets and figure out how we are going to organize ourselves And what we will withhold from them, whether it is our labor or our time in the classroom, it's not going to happen. And again, to go back to the Kavanaugh decision, they don't care. They're going to confirm him. So we have to figure out how we're going to garner the courage to fight. So we need to raise hell, we need to raise expectations, and then we need to raise revenue. And you know what? There's a lot of rich people out there. Don't think you have to answer the question of where that revenue is coming from. Mike's going to answer that because he's in the State House. No, they killed our fair share amendment, which would have raised taxes on millionaires and pay for this. But there are many, many ways to get that money back from the rich. Our job is to raise our expectations, to raise hell, and go out and get it. Now is a really fast 6 minutes. Whew. Thank you all.
That's a tough act to follow. I never wish to follow Barbara, but let's hear it for Barbara one more time. One of my personal heroes in this work. Thank you, Barbara. My name is Mike Conley. I have the honor of representing Cambridge and Somerville in the Massachusetts State Legislature. It's my first term serving in office. I challenged a moderate Democrat, someone who had championed charter schools over the years, challenged him from the left, and with the help of people like Jonathan King and Cole back there and many people in my community, we defeated that incumbent Democrat who had won 38 elections in a row. And now in my first term in the legislature, I'm so glad we are naming this concept neoliberalism, because once you understand it, you start to see it everywhere. And I've gone out of my way to name our state budget. This isn't an opinion. The technical correct term for our budgetary program in our state is that we are in a state of austerity. And in what has been called the richest state in the richest country in the history of the world, it really is unfathomable to me why that is the case. In doing my work, I've had the chance to work closely with folks like the MTA, with Phenom, with groups like the Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance, which is just getting going. And I think some of the things that I've learned is that, inequality is present and it's rising at our state institutions. I prepared a few notes here. I'll sit down if that's okay. Recent study by the New York Times shows that 42% of UMass Amherst students, for example, come from the upper 20% of the income bracket. And then when you look to the lower 20% of the income bracket, just 6% of students are represented at the UMass Amherst system, for example. And these issues are really troubling. I'll tell you just a little bit about my own background as well, because it really informs, my approach to these issues. I was raised in public housing. As a kid, I benefited from things like Head Start as a kid. I never really saw college in my future. No, people in my family hadn't been to college. Fortunately, as you saw when I was standing, I'm sort of a giant, and so I actually got a full athletic scholarship to Duke University, then went on to law school and became an attorney. And as I started to reflect on my own experience, I started to think, if I wasn't a giant, big, white dude who had certain privileges, those opportunities probably wouldn't have been made available to me. And that understanding is really what motivates me to change this regime of neoliberalism that we've heard about. So, let's put some real numbers to this. Since 2001, when you account for inflation and you account for increasing enrollment, according to the Massachusetts Budget Policy Center, state investment in public education has fallen by about 1/3. It's unbelievable to me. 33% decrease once you account for inflation and higher enrollment. Right now, more students graduate with debt from public college than from private college. And the average student debt at a 4-year public university in Massachusetts is about $30,000. And so that results in, students being priced out, students being discouraged, students being burdened with loans and not being able to pursue the types of opportunities that they'd like to pursue after graduation. And I think that's really a broken promise. And again, as I think about what my policies are and the goals that I'm trying to advance as part of a movement, we need free public higher education for everyone. We need free higher education for everyone. And we also have to do things about student debt, and we need to relieve and forgive all the student debt that's out there. This is an enormous crisis facing our country. Looks like I have a couple minutes left. I'll tell you about the budget we passed just this year, the FY19 budget. It appropriated $1.2 billion for higher education. That's about 3.9% over the FY18 total. But then when you break it down, it's in three different segments. There's community colleges, there's state universities. The community colleges and the state universities saw between a 4 and 5% increase in their funding. The UMass system saw a 1.1% increase in its funding. And again, when you consider inflation and enrollment, that's actually a decrease in funding to the UMass system. And that's why I've been here to campus several times. I've marched in front of the State House with UMass faculty and students. I hear the stories from my constituents. I hear about students who have one extra class they need to finish here at UMass Boston, but then their teacher gets laid off and they can't complete that class, and that messes up their life. This is wildly unacceptable in this time of profound wealth and income inequality. And so, the answer, I think, going forward is, we need to raise revenue. It's very simple. We need to look to those people, particularly the very wealthy, particularly corporations, large institutions here in our Commonwealth. We need to take some money from them, and we need to put it into public education. It's quite simple. There's some other great things that I'm working on. My colleague, Rep. Natalie Higgins, she's working on a bill. It's in your packet, a student loan bill of rights. Proud to be a co-sponsor of that. I believe we need a people's budget on the federal level and the state level. We need to raise billions of dollars. Our state budget today is about $3.5 billion less than it was 20 years ago when you adjust for inflation. There's absolutely no excuse for that. And final point, and I'll wrap it up right now, I printed this out. Everyone should know about the 2012 Quebec student strike. Who has heard of the student strike? I'll tell you what happened in Quebec. They said up in Quebec, things are too easy here. We need to do some austerity of our own. And they said, here's what they said. They said, we're going to raise fees $325 per year for about 5 years. You know what those students said? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students, they said, hell no, we're not going to pay $325 more per year. They took to the streets, they shut the city down. And so I think that's a real lesson for us. Google this Quebec resistance in 2012. You'll see the street filled with students who said no to austerity, and we need to be thinking along those lines as well. Thanks for having me.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Put some notes down, so I'm going to read through those. But anyway, my name is Tony Vandam, and I'm Senior Lecturer in Africana Studies Department. And I don't like beer. I don't drink beer. So first I want to thank the committee for inviting me, and I also want to take the opportunity to thank Barbara for her leadership as president of the MTA and for upholding an inclusive practice that encourage critical exchange among the leaders as well as the membership. And that's the kind of leadership that I think is very important for the work that we do. So while I was invited to participate in this forum, I was then disinvited. And eventually I was re-invited. And so it's safe to say that the question of inclusion is a constant struggle, especially for people of color. I must say that I was outraged that the president of my union, FSU, would actually politic to exclude me from this forum. And maybe I would be wrong that free speech and my First Amendment right, particularly in an academic institution, is something a president of a union would uphold. Maybe I would be wrong that inclusion of faculty ideas, despite their different views, is something that we would uphold in the academy. However, I am in full support of increasing federal and state investment in higher education. At the same time, we need to be certain that those resources are used equitably to assist underserved urban student populations of color to successfully matriculate at this and other public universities. We need to make sure that all faculty are paid and treated equitably. We need leadership in our unions among our students, staff, faculty, and elected officials to ensure education is viewed as a right and not a privilege for those that can afford it. The deepening privatization of public education is becoming a factor along with private universities in the gentrification of our urban neighborhoods. Not only is this having an impact on students, it's having a deep impact on our staff and faculty. But the impact is the greatest on working class communities of color whose education and income further marginalize and limits them from being able to live decent lives. According to a Pew report, the net income of a single, or the net worth of a single black female is only $5. The National Center for Poverty points out that 73% of children in poor families lives with a single parent. With the high rate on single mothers, how are they able to provide the basic necessities for their families? How do we expect students to come from these families to not only concentrate on their studies, but to also successfully matriculate without incurring burdensome debt? As students, staff, faculty, and administrators, how can we allow the state and federal government to spend public money to profit corporations while public institutions and infrastructures deteriorate? We clearly need accountability and transparent leadership. We also have to do our part to ensure that, that there are consequences for negligent and incompetent leadership unable to properly represent its constituency. We can't be naive to assume that those in power will do the right thing. It is absolutely absurd that, according to the Pentagon, it's costing the U.S. government $45 billion per year for the war in Afghanistan. We have to organize ourselves from the very bottom of the most disenfranchised groups to ensure that their voices are heard and that their needs are included in our agenda and program of action. Our continuing struggle to change the power relationship is one of the central needs of ordinary working people. The central needs of ordinary working people are met. This means that we have to also engage urban communities, organizations, churches, and neighborhood groups in this process. It is their children and communities that are impacted by the lack of public resources. They are also an important base that will make and keep elected officials accountable. With the engagement of local communities, we need to organize a mass democratic and inclusive movement to force state and federal government to fully fund public education. We need to set an example that other states can follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Excuse me, I'm going to use slides. Some of us academics can't get by without slides. Now, of course, I won't be able to find them. Just a minute, here we go. All right, there's some slides up there on the screen. Yes, okay. Who, slideshow. Okay. All right. So, everybody here knows that the leading edge of your fight has been with the state legislature. But I want to talk about the federal budget. It's easy to lose sight of the federal budget. We may curse the highways, but the fact of the matter is, for most Americans, the interstate highway system was a great benefit in rural America, improving economy and communications. Many of us got here on the red line. Those cars were bought with federal funds, your tax dollars. They were maintained for years with federal tax dollars, and then that program was offed, and with the resulting deterioration of the public transit system from the disinvestment followed from Regan. In Boston and Cambridge, public housing is a key resource. 10% of the housing in Cambridge is still public housing after World War II. That was absolutely key for veterans and other families. People like myself make their living doing biomedical research, and my students, every single bit of it funded by your tax dollars through the National Institutes of Health. It's absolutely critical. Now, in fact, in the United States, James Madison said it, education is the true foundation of civil liberty. There's a long tradition of public support for public education. Every state in the Union has tuition-free K-12 education. Most states subsidize the higher education system. There was a period when it was key: University of California, University of Wisconsin, the UMass system. Now that has changed in the past 20 years, as we've heard, but we have to remember that was the history. In Europe, most European countries, higher education is free. You don't have to pay tuition. But in fact, it's worth just going over what the history is. Starts in the Civil War with the Morrill Act. Lincoln drove through the Congress, right, to establish the land-grant universities, which said that instruction should be offered in agriculture and the mechanic arts without excluding other scientific and classical studies, including military tactics. That was Lincoln, right? They were need to train engineers for the North in the Civil War. The Hatch Acts then brought in money for agricultural research. That's still, the UMass Amherst still has a unit that comes from that history of federal funding of agricultural research. After World War II, we get a new phase, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill. Paul went to college here at UMass Boston on the GI Bill. 2.2 million veterans, right, got all their tuition paid to go to college, and hundreds of colleges in the United States avoided bankruptcy because of that federal support for tuition. And by the way, that generated one of the first waves of the expansion of high school teaching. Veterans who went to college then went into high school teaching. Then we have Sputnik, crisis in the nation. How come the commies can put up, this thing around the earth? What's the conclusion? Science education in the Soviet Union leaves science education in the U.S. behind. The Congress passes the National Defense Education Act, which provides all kinds of funding for college students, high school teachers, to increase not only production of scientists, but teaching of languages, et cetera. Now, that was a lot of those advances under Reagan and Thatcher on the other side of the Atlantic. The reversal started. Barbara mentioned James Pizer. I mean, this is a guy know nothing about education, right? He volunteered for Sunday school, and then, you know, a friend of his daddy made him Secretary of Education, Commissioner of Education. He was the president of the Pioneer Institute, the Massachusetts arm of the American Heritage Foundation. Very sad situation. All right. But in the 2016 election, Bernie Sanders stepped forward and put forward as one of his major platform planks 4 years of tuition-free public college and universities for families with incomes under $125,000. The estimate is that'll cost $75 billion. Sanders' campaign and our revolution proposes financing it from just reversing some of these tax giveaways, billions of dollars in tax giveaways, little tiny, less than 1% transaction on fiscal speculation in Wall Street would raise that amount of money. And the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which produces each year a people's budget, Mike talked about getting a people's budget from Massachusetts, identifies a half a dozen real tax reforms, getting rid of outrageous loopholes that would produce hundreds of billions of dollars. $75 billion would be chump change. I want to end, but let's look at the actual federal budget. So there's the federal budget 2017 that Congress voted. Almost all of that is our income taxes. Little bit is corporate income taxes, but corporate income taxes have been going way down compared to individual income taxes. And all education, which is Title I and lots of subsidies to disadvantaged groups, was 6% in 2017. And there, the blue, $668 billion for Pentagon accounts, more than half of all the income taxes we send to the federal government. Now, the IRS and the Department of Treasury, federal government, has never written back to any of you who have paid your taxes how they spent the money, right? Because they know that if you knew that, it might change your mind a little bit. Now, I'm going to end with one last slide about a slice of this that would take care of the $75 billion. That's an Ohio-class nuclear submarine. The United States maintains 14 of them. Each of them can launch 24 missiles. Each missile has 8 independently guided warheads. One submarine launching its missiles obliterate all the major cities of any country on Earth, Russia, India, China. If 2 submarines, intentionally or inadvertently, because they thought there was an attack, launched their missiles, that would generate a nuclear winter sufficiently extreme that life on Earth, doesn't matter where you lived, would be all over. So the only rational thing to do is to reduce the number of nuclear submarines. What's in the current budget? 8 more, about $100 billion. Now, as you'll hear from Paul, this doesn't really come from the middle. This comes from the corporations that manufacture them, enormously profitable, invisible war profits without war. Extremely dangerous. The money is there. We have to start talking to our Congress people about. It's not enough to say more money for public education. We have to say take the money from the Pentagon or from the taxes. We have to tell our state reps, our city councilors. We have to tell Ayanna Pressley, our new U.S. Congresswoman, about this and kind of change the debate on this. So thank you very much for listening. Paul wants it. Stay up there.
When I enrolled at UMass Boston in 1968, tuition was $50 a semester. Let me add that the most important lesson I learned at UMass Boston was that I had a right to a mind of my own. The claim that the national security of the United States requires that more than half the nation's discretionary budget must be devoted to the maintenance of armies, global strategic bases, and massive armaments is false. Until we can convince the majority of the public of this fiction and surmount the wall of disinformation, nothing will change, and so we will continue down the road to a hellish future. That statement, of course, contradicts the incessant indoctrination emanating from Washington and the corporate media that U.S. foreign policy is devoted to the maintenance of global peace and a liberal and just world order in the face of enemies who wish to destroy that order. The facts controvert such declarations, yet to emphasize them is to be accused of disloyalty, a lack of patriotism, and conspiracy mongering. The U.S. propaganda system relentlessly broadcasts the malevolent machinations of Russia, Iran, or North Korea, or Syria and China, as well as of armed gangs like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. The drumbeat that mortal danger is on our doorstep is so ceaseless and all-encompassing that the public either accepts the claims as true or remains blind to the very real dangers posed by our own government's own militarized policies that call forth the very forms of opposition to those policies. The reality is that all of the wars, assassinations, and coups carried out by Washington in the last half-century have been matters of choice based not on genuine threats to our national security, but on jeopardy to the profits of giant arms manufacturers and their allies, the so-called military-industrial complex that extends its tentacles into every major institution in American life: Congress, the CIA, the media, universities, of course. The complex requires, at the very least, the implied threat of war to ensure its existence. How many citizens are aware that at the end of World War II, the chief of wartime production exclaimed that the country needed, quote, a permanent war economy? His rationale centered on the fact that in the absence of massive war production and the guaranteed profits that flowed from war contracts, numerous corporations that had grown to gargantuan proportions would suddenly be bankrupted. There was also the problem of millions of returning veterans who would be in no mood to stand in unemployment lines. Since a permanent war economy required a permanent enemy, Washington hawks duly asserted that the nation needed a national security state and a renamed Department of War, Department of Defense, to contain the new purported threat to international peace. The reality was that the USSR was extremely weakened by its overwhelming losses in the war and posed no military threat to the West and was relatively easily contained. So unthreatening was the world environment in reality that Washington deliberately chose war in Korea to set the permanent warfare state in motion. Secretary of State Dean Acheson was even heard to exclaim, "Thank God Korea came along," in gratitude that he could then triple the so-called defense budget. Understand that both world wars were emerging well before widespread and all-out conflict erupted. The great game was the same then as it is now and always revolves around the issue of which nation and which national oligarchy is to profit most from the control of resources, markets, and access to the cheapest sources of labor at the expense of rivals. Massive arms races co-evolved with this economic competition and soon led to worldwide conflagration. As the world fractures into ultranationalism yet again, and mutual distrust and suspicion intensifies, it is no exaggeration to warn that our very species is at stake. Total defense spending since 9/11 has more than doubled, almost to $1 trillion annually. Thus, as accelerated arms spending has coupled with bellicose policies masquerading as defense, we witness that our alleged adversaries and enemies have quadrupled. Since 9/11, military operations employing the latest and most expensive high-tech weapons began in Afghanistan and have since spread to Iraq and Libya, to Syria, to Yemen, and to various nations in Africa. Last week, reports surfaced that American B-52 bombers are overflying areas in the South China Sea. I'm being told that my time is up, so I guess I will just... Actually, Only the other day, Kay Bailey Hutchison, former senator from Texas, ambassador to NATO, declared that the U.S. should take out certain missiles in Russia. Last week, reports surfaced that American B-52 bombers are overflying areas in the South China Sea. This week, a U.S. Navy destroyer entered the same area, thereby deliberately increasing tensions with that growing superpower. Meanwhile, the beneficiary of investments in the arms industries, like Massachusetts' own Raytheon Corporation, enjoy ever fast-track profits for missiles rained down on Yemen. They quite literally are making a killing from killing. Mounting public pressure against Washington's support for the illegal Saudi war against Yemen almost led to the decertification of pending sale of 123,000 precision-guided missiles by Raytheon to the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. The Wall Street Journal recently revealed that the acting Assistant Secretary of State was a longtime lobbyist for Raytheon and played a key role in salvaging this $2 billion arms deal for the company. May I continue? In the aftermath of the Depression of 2008, the Federal Reserve Bank injected trillions of dollars fabricated out of thin air into the largest banks, including those that had caused the financial breakdown, and which then refused to loan it to ordinary Americans who had been ruined by the crisis and needed it most. How much of the nation's $13.2 trillion of household debt could have been remedied with such a sum, or the $1.5 trillion in unsustainable student debt? Such an amount could have financed free college, universal health care, federal jobs programs, aid for underwater mortgages, clean energy, etc. The reprehensible existence of homelessness, of mass homelessness, and hungry children could be resolved. A government dominated by the merchants of death drains the lifeblood of civil society and portends another economic collapse and ultimately threatens all with global war. Again, until we can persuade the public to face these harsh facts, nothing will change. The stakes are nothing less than critical. Thank you.
I thought the idea was to see if if there would be a little discussion between, like, reaction from one to another of the folks up here at the front, but we're also interested in any questions and comments from those who are in the room. So why don't we first see if there are any questions, or anyone would like to add something? Just raise your hand. Yeah, just speak up.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think, joining activist organizations and being a part of different movements that are happening right now is a great way to do it. We're seeing a lot of electoral change, whether you look at the remarkable Alan Presley campaign or candidates like Mika Elgardo, who won a remarkable race in Jamaica Plain, running on a real left-wing platform. So stay engaged. And feel free to reach out to me anytime for further ideas.
Yeah.
So thank you to the panel. Really great. It looks like Zach's taping it, so I hope we can really spread the tape around, because I thought you all did a great job and so much connected. So I want to kind of try to put the last few talks together a little bit and pose a challenge just to the group. I don't know if it's exactly a sharp question, but it's, so much of Jonathan King's talk, when you looked about the good precedent of the past, the Moral Act and Hatch Acts and GI Bill, the post-Sputnik investment in science education, all the
I think we should ask Barbara to start out with an answer, since she wants to raise hell, but hopefully not raise more nuclear silos. Maybe raise, R-A-Z-E, a few nuclear silos.
Can't hear my voice? I sound so loud to myself. You know, that it's about public higher education for democracy, for, you know, the development of a more equitable, for more just world, for the development of the capacity for empathy and really meaningful critical thinking to be able to take on power and know what it means to be an active citizen in a democratic process. And, you know, part of what's happening is, like, not only, I mean, I really appreciate your point, Joe, and I think it's a great connection to make there, but, like, we also just see, in general, like, the arguments that we get for higher education right now are not about democracy. Excuse me. They're about, you know, workforce development and about us doing the work of preparing people to go work for corporations. And we need to refuse that. I don't want to talk about higher education in terms of workforce development. I'm so sorry, I'm losing my voice. I want to talk about public higher education as the place where we learn to take on power and create a better world. And so just like I refuse the conversations about, thank you, austerity and refuse an austerity narrative, we have to refuse the narrative of the purpose of public higher education as some sort of technical workforce experience and then make those connections, I think. But I think to the degree that we're envisioning public education for the greater good, it's a doorway into, therefore we shouldn't be funding it through a military economy. Like, I think that's a way in.
So it's also very interesting during those good times that, you know, black people, people of color, wasn't having good times either, right? So, you know, the question of inclusion, you know, is definitely a piece that we have to make sure, because, you know, we'll get resources, but who will they go to, right? And so we know that the resources that we do have, they're going to these corporations that's about destruction, right? You know, but at the same time, if it's just to add more, you know, more privilege and to create division amongst, you know, working people, you know. So you talk about, you know, let's build this middle class and so forth, but what about everybody else, right? So, you know, we have to really keep that in mind, is that if we're trying to create change, we can't keep change to make some people comfortable. We have to create change from those who are the most impacted, right? You know, in terms of dealing with that. And so we tend to forget that, especially when it comes to what people look like, right? And so, you know, even looking at UMass Boston, it's one of the most diverse schools, yes, you know, but what about its faculty? What about, you know, staff, administration, and so forth, and even the dwindling student population in terms of who's actually going to be able to come here based on the costs, right? I mean, we're complaining because, you know, we're going to have to pay extra money for parking, right? You know, but, you know, there are people who are not going to be able to afford tuition, you know, and so forth. So we got to make sure that there's equitable, you know, there's some equity in terms of where, you know, those resources go. And, of course, we got to organize. But we just can't, you know, organize this on our university, right? We got to get out of the classrooms. We got to get out of this institution. We got to go to the communities, you know, whose students who come before us, and organize them to begin to make politicians accountable, right? You know, to get the churches to make people accountable, you know, but we haven't been doing a good job in doing that. We've just been focusing on our own domain versus trying to deal with a more, you know, broader a network and develop a more democratic and inclusive movement that's from the bottom up.
Excellent question. Right on about the history, but Barbara put it out there. We have to reject the notion higher education, for corporations. No, higher education, because in this world, you cannot participate in this world without higher education, right? You got to know the difference between the ozone layer and CO2, and methane, and chlorocarbons, and a million other things. But one small thing, if you look, there's college, there's private. Massachusetts is a good example because it's such a mixture of public and private universities. There's hardly any organizational unity among those institutions. 50 private colleges in the Boston area, the number of faculty at a private college who came to support the battle over the UMass Boston, the higher education budget in the legislature. No, right? The Boston College people are organized about, getting the hockey team better and MIT and things like that. So one of the things about this forum, it's not a big forum, but this is about one of the first times where we gather together some people, both from the private sector and the public sector, and say, listen, we got to work together, right? If they divide and conquer and they can separate out, the different sectors, we don't have a chance. Now, it's not easy. There are, the MTA does a great job organizing on the public campuses, but I'm not aware of any MTA or AFT chapters on private campuses. We don't even have a faculty senate at MIT, forget about a faculty union. So there are some small steps of just having people on campuses recognize we are in this together. If UMass Boston goes down, right, that is a defeat for anybody who believes in higher education. And, this is the most diverse of the campuses in the Boston area, right? So it's not an abstract thing. It's a blow to the underrepresented, to people of color, for whom UMass Boston has been the lead, way up. So we got a lot of work to do, but we're getting started.
I wanted to I want to thank all the panelists. I wanted to add one thing that is sort of an answer to a question around here about so what should we be doing? I think one thing is that we're all in this room, so that shows that we're all doing something. We could all be watching TV or on our Netflix or whatever right now. We're all delaying our trip home, or we have other events. I know that Mike is going to go speak at something in Watertown pretty soon. But one thing I will say, as someone I used to teach at Salem State, and I teach at BU, I'm around Cambridge a lot, I sure see a lot more people with buttons and tables and stickers for things that have nothing to do with progressive change. Every now and then I see ACLU people trying to get some money and getting membership, and that's important, but I see a ton of religious stuff. I see people from the right wing, and I don't see left of center or progressive groups doing more than maybe knocking on doors when it's time to elect a candidate. And so that's my dream, and my hope is that teachers, staff, and students, who you're the future, we can start to equal, even if it's just having a house party here and there, or making up our own stickers, or forming a chapter of whatever it is that turns you on. Our Revolution, Indivisible, Democratic Socialists of America. There are a lot of organizations doing a lot of important work, and it's a huge fight. So, my email's out there. Anyone who wants to email me, I'd be happy to show up at a meeting and try to help y'all get organized. I know we have another panel, but I wanted to see if we want to sort of get these guys to stay around, but we want to listen to some other people that are in the room. I see my good friend Jean-Leslie René, who's a professor here and also a high school teacher, and I know there are some other people here. We wanted to hear from a few other panelists, but is there one last question for this group up here? Yes, sure.
I'll just say really briefly, and then I'll give this to Mike. I don't think about this in terms of political parties. The Democrats have screwed us as much as anybody in this, so I think, and I say that by way of saying like we shouldn't be thinking in terms of political parties. We should be thinking as we're talking to somebody about who they are, about what they care about what they want for their children, for their nieces and nephews, for the future. And I think when we have conversations that are about what do we really value, that we discover that we actually share a lot of the same values. And if we start there and we build around issues that are close to home, that we care about, I think we build the kind of relationships that will build power. And that's where it has to be. And like, with all respect to Mike, who I don't understand how he stays in that state house, that's not where we should be looking right now. We really need to be looking at how we're going to build power together in our communities, on our campuses, as Tony says, beyond our campus, like build from the ground up. And that's what we need to be thinking about and how we need to be talking to each other.
So Barbara is right, and her whole idea is that we got to raise hell, right? So that we have to heat up the situation, because change doesn't happen when people are comfortable, and we have to make some folks very uncomfortable in order to create the change that we want, right? And Barbara's right again. It's going to take power. It's going to take people power to create the kind of consequences for people when they don't do the right thing. Unfortunately, we're still very comfortable, and many of us here are very privileged. And so, but I'm talking about we got to deal with people who, they don't have places to stay. They don't have, a milk for the baby, right? I mean, they're in desperate situation. When those of us in here who are privileged can begin to identify and be there with those who are in that situation and go to the people who are responsible, that's when we're going to create change and put the pressure on them and not relent. That's when we're going to create the change that we need. But other than that, it's going to be business as usual, right? You understand? So we need to be clear that we have to make a deeper commitment about creating transformation in society, and it means, in ways, surrendering the kind of privilege we think we have, right, so that we could go and deal with those who are less privileged and who's getting kicked, on the ground almost every day.
Well, I wholeheartedly associate myself with both of those answers, and I'd say there are a lot of hopeful things happening out there. I mean, West Virginia, you look at those teachers' strikes, that's no progressive state. That's thought of as usually a red state. Arizona, places like that. You see people like Andrew Gillum winning this tremendous race in the state of Florida. Beto O'Rourke, who's running for Senate down in Texas right now. These are people who are running on bold leftist agendas, and they're winning and they're organizing in places where people didn't think it was possible. And I think that's a reflection of just how desperate and how much of a crisis we are in, that people across the board are now waking up and realizing there needs to be change. So we're in a tough place, but I think there's hope if we just keep working together and fighting forward.
All right. Can we give a round of applause to our first panel? So it's my job and the job of the next panel to take all of this that we just discussed for the past hour and bring it home here to UMass Boston. So could I have Juan Blanco from Phenom, Yelena Mitic-Elliott, Professor Jean-Leslie Renee, Professor Randy Albelda, and Professor Marlene Kim come on down? And I'm going to take the time while they're coming down to talk a little bit. Mike said West Virginia and this and that. Well, there's another place where there's been a lot of organizing and demonstrations and disruptions, and it's here at UMass Boston. So how many people have went to the ribbon cutting protest? A few people. Was there anybody who was at Convocation the other week? Anybody who was there when we disrupted the Convocation to protest the austerity that's being imposed on campus? So yeah. There's some action going on here. If you weren't involved in those actions, there's a sheet in your packet. Put your email down on it and leave it at the back or bring it up here, and we'll get in touch with you about organizing on campus here at UMass Boston. Next week, we are planning a student organizing meeting to talk about next steps and how we can organize against tuition and fee increases, against the massive student debt that we're facing, against the budget cuts and the austerity that we're seeing. So we're doing that organizing at the student level and then working in partnership with faculty and staff and the community around us to do this work. So I hope that you'll be involved in that here on campus. The other thing is, this fight at UMass Boston, I think it's been well said, is kind of the vanguard and the front edge of what we're seeing across the state. And this UMass Boston fight is part of Phenom's statewide work and also part of the Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance, MAJA, which fights for universal, free, and equitable public education from pre-K through college. So we're doing this work here on campus, and then we're bringing it up to the statewide level, and also hopefully in a couple of years we'll have a chance at the federal level to raise some hell and raise some expectations as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our second panel on the value of UMass Boston to the Boston area community, starting with Professor Marlene Kim from the Department of Economics. And I'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you. I don't know if Tony's still here, but I did not exclude you from politic to exclude you, okay? So in economics, we call public higher education a public good. This means that public higher education benefits more than the college graduate. It benefits the community, so we should be subsidized more than we are today. College grads earn over millions more over their lifetime compared to non-college graduates. So they pay more taxes to state and federal governments. There's less crime because college graduates are more likely to be employed and less likely to commit crimes. And we teach people how to think. We produce informed citizens so that they can vote for the right people. We increase productivity, so it's no wonder that there was a post-World War II boom, in part from the GI Bill that Jonathan mentioned, because there was a lot more educated, college-educated population due to that, and more veterans getting free college educations. So public higher education is an economic development model for Boston, which is why the federal government and state should fund public higher education. So I want to tell you why state and federal money should especially fund UMass Boston. As was mentioned before, UMass Boston is unique. We are a majority-minority campus. We serve English language learners. We serve low-income students and first-generation college students. We serve the underserved. By providing access to public higher education to those who otherwise would not have this, we help to reduce racial and income inequality in the Commonwealth. Because most of our students stay in Massachusetts and in the Boston area, we add to economic growth, productivity in Massachusetts, and an educated workforce for employers so they don't have to hire as many out-of-state workers. We educate students no one else will educate. One of my students was homeless. One had no heat. We perform miracles here on this campus. UMass Boston was founded when, in 1964, 1,400 qualified students lived in Boston but were rejected from the UMass system in Amherst because there were not enough spaces for them. So UMass Boston was created to provide affordable university education to metropolitan Boston residents and to apply university quality research to critical urban issues. In 1966, At the Founding Day convocation, UMass Boston's Chancellor, John OBrien, read our university statement of purpose. He said, "We have an obligation to see that the opportunities we offer are equal to the best that private schools have to offer." Are we doing this? Are we achieving these goals? As you all know, UMass Boston has been in a crisis for a couple of years. Faculty were not reappointed 2 years ago. Staff were cut last year. And this year, centers and institutes are being cut. These are the same centers and institutes that were created to apply university quality research to critical urban issues. When we should have more money because students here need more support, the opposite occurs. We have less money. We've been begging for money from the legislature, but it has not been appropriated. They say there's no money. But as Barbara says, there is money. It's just being spent somewhere else. As most of you know, when UMass Boston was first built in 1974 and first opened there, the cement that was used was flawed, and the university started falling apart immediately and continues to do so. We needed new buildings. We needed a new parking garage because the garage was under the buildings and concrete's falling down in that structure. But we never got money from the state for these. We got some money, we got some loans, but then we have to pay the principal and interest back. So as I told the Board of Trustees recently, it's like a contractor built your house that immediately starts falling apart. And the contractor says, "We'll build you a new house, but you have to pay additional principal and interest for this new house that replaces the flawed one that we just built for you that's now falling apart." So this is what the state, the UMass system, and the Board of Trustees have been telling us here on our campus. But it's immoral to tell us that we have to pay for our own new buildings, our own new garage, that students, faculty, and staff have to pay for something we had nothing to do with. So I'm here with you, and I guess Mike's left, to urge the state to make good on their promise to provide an affordable university education and apply university quality research to critical urban issues, and that we fulfill our obligation to offer opportunities that are equal to the best that private schools have to offer. I hope we can work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Next is Professor Randy Albelda.
Hi. I'm at the end of a cold and have almost lost my voice. We'll see. No, I've got some water, thanks. But then someone else can get sick. Because of who attends UMass Boston and who we are in the capital city, in one of the most unequal cities in the nation, UMass Boston has always had the amorphous title of having an urban mission. While this has taken on various meanings, it broadly means that we serve Boston, and in particular, that we serve those most needing serving. And Marlene outlined who those are. If you go to UMB's webpage today, the front webpage, there's a picture of a diverse group of students and a banner that says Boston's Public Research University. If you can find the webpage that says missions and values, one part says, and I quote, "Our distinguished scholarship, dedicated teaching, and engaged public service are mutually reinforcing, creating new knowledge while serving the public good of our city, our commonwealth, our nation, and our world. So UMass Boston puts as its public face that we are a public research university for the public good. Now, that can be contested, but to me that means research that actually has impactful meaning for the people that we're talking about, which means that it needs to be accessible. It needs to be available. That's not to say that we can't do other forms of research, but this particular form of research seems to be something that we at UMass Boston have been called upon to do. But as with so many other aspects of our lives in public higher education, these terms and notions of public research are contested, and oftentimes, unless we contest them vigorously, they're decided by those doing the evaluation of research rather than those who are producing it. And this trend is happening, and it's particularly happening here and in other places. What trends am I talking about specifically? I'll mention 3 of them. Tenure, promotion, and merit evaluations at UMass Boston and elsewhere heavily weight publications only in academic venues. That means they're refereed, and even though that referee process can be as ad hoc or corrupt, there's some journals you can actually buy your paper to get in and reviewed. But I would say worse than that, unless you're like a superstar, or you're doing something incredibly in the atmosphere, only about 20 people read whatever's in an academic journal. Policy reports, research with or for the legislature, or that address advocacy groups are treated as service, not as research. I think this creates a disincentive for researchers, faculty, to actually do public research. So there's one. The other, which I think is actually more important, or as important, is this push to substitute private dollars for our loss of public dollars. And how has UMass in particular tried to do this? Get grants. Get grants from anywhere. And philanthropists, so there's Jonathan, you talked about the National Science Grants. I'm talking about the other forms of grants. There's lots of billionaires who have set up all sorts of foundations and are happy to give research money for some research. But these philanthropists think of themselves as quote-unquote thought leaders. And they more often think of the way that they think is what should be researched and distributed. So often they're not that interested in research that challenges the status quo. And certainly they're not often that interested in research that benefits the public. I'll give you one example. I believe it was the Koch brothers who went to the University of Utah, who also saw their public dollars cut, and offered them a pantload of money to set up a new economics department dedicated to free markets. They have an economics department that's dedicated to teaching a variety of perspectives in economics. Public higher ed is finding outside money incredibly appealing, and philanthropists, quote unquote, wealthy people who made money off of ripping off plunder, if you will, are using that money then now to buy the kind of research they want. A third way, specifically UMass Boston, and Marlene mentioned this, is the attack, I would call it, on centers and institutes. The centers and institutes at UMass Boston were specifically put together primarily to serve underserved groups in the Boston area. I've done enormous amounts of research through those institutes, in particular the Center for Social Policy, which is focused on low-income families in Boston, Massachusetts, the Center for Women in Politics, but there's the Gaston Institute, the Trotter Institute, the Paul Ure Institute, the Joyner Institute, they're the Labor Resource Center. They are literally littered throughout UMass Boston, and those centers and institutes can't go knocking on these same philanthropists' doors and say, "Oh, please give me money to challenge what you're doing." So the mission of UMass Boston is being undermined, I think, not only by our own administrators, but by this lack of funding. So I would argue we need to contest, as others have argued, on many fronts. We need to contest our own colleagues for calling this kind of research service. We need to make sure that the administration still values this so that it can't be the purview of full professors because there's no penalty to them, as well as the legislature, so that we don't get bought off to do research for the hands, for, as I would say, free market research. So I'll end there for now.
Next, talking about responding to our immigrant communities is Professor Jean-Leslie René.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank everybody here, particularly my dear friend Jane. We went back way back in Haiti, right? So, but in any case, it's very interesting to be here, to be talking about immigrants and University of Massachusetts and Boston, etc. But in reality, the conversation could be way much more larger than UMass Boston. But we'll kind of try to restrict it to UMass Boston because it's a very important conversation too. And so far, things that are happening in UMass Boston. First, I'd like to start by trying to dispel a certain number of misperceptions about immigrants in this country, and so far education is concerned. So it is well established that more than 2 million immigrants and second-generation Americans are enrolled full-time in U.S. colleges. They represent about 20% of U.S. colleges students and 24% of community colleges as well. So this is to tell you that immigrants are not just here just to steal people's jobs and stuff like that, but they do go to college, they do attend to a certain number of interesting values that this society value very much. But educational attainment also is very high among certain groups of immigrants, particularly you would find like almost a third of foreign-born individuals living in the U.S. have a bachelor's degree or higher degrees. And thanks to certainly the cultural capital, because they do bring also cultural capital that you can value, you can estimate in many different ways. But those immigrant groups have been able to show strong intergenerational progress on educational attainment, irrespective of disadvantageous backgrounds and even amid dire circumstances. Educational attainment is the single strongest predictor of socio-economic attainment in immigrant communities. And the immigrant drive, immigrants arriving here in that destination country with a strong disposition for achievement, and its achievement at many different levels. But the immigrant drive, which they attempt to pass on to their children through emphasizing their educational attainment, will also be very central into the development of this country. No one could really, up to this day, ascertain to the fact that the very wealth of this country rests very heavily on the shoulder of immigrants, or the son of immigrants, daughters of immigrants, etc. And then I'm not just talking about, menial jobs. We're talking about high-level jobs, high-level production, and scientific and literary production. However, we do have also groups of immigrants that social economic studies prevent them and affect them negatively in terms of educational achievement. And those immigrant groups tend to be put on the side, and just like if it was of their fault that they cannot achieve at the highest level in certain circumstances. It has to be thought in terms of the system itself, how the system integrates those immigrants and then cast them into particular roles in those societies. That could be discussed further later. But in any case, UMass as an urban university has grown to become a multicultural connector, bringing various ethnic groups across metropolitan Boston, and it ought to be a driving force for success for actually 17,000 students from about 150 countries and speaking close to 90 different languages. I would never thought of that, but it is the reality. We are a very diverse type of cultural and linguistic community here. It's the most diverse public research university in New England, and predicated on a special commitment to urban and global engagement. This diverse urban campus community has also 60% of its undergraduates and 30% of graduate students being underrepresented minorities. As such, UMass is a minority-serving institution. But it should be pointed out that immigrants also serve the campus tremendously well by enhancing its diversity profile, offering an edge for campus cultural and geographic diversity that UMass prides itself in. It brings valued cultural, linguistic, educational, and experiential diversity to UMass, strengthening the global competitiveness of that institution. Diversity is an educational asset, for it depends our understanding of differences. It enhances creativity. It encourages the search for novel information and perspectives, leading to better decision-making and problem-solving. Obviously, UMass' diverse student body includes people of all social studies, including those at the margin and those at the bottom of the social ladder, still strongly striving for social mobility through educational attainment in a bid to eventually better fit in a highly dynamic and knowledge-intensive economy. Yet, graduating had been at best elusive for many immigrants at the university, particularly those who are trapped in unskilled, low-paying jobs, and as UMass itself struggles with low graduation rate of 40 to 60% in 4 to 6 years. While UMass claims improvement is deemed imperative, but a clear plan along with adequate resources are not forthcoming yet. Many reasons why college graduation rates are so low may include financial barriers, many students struggling to get into classes they need for graduation, students underprepared and overwhelmed by the rigor of college and not receiving adequate support from the school. Top schools keep students enrolled by offering generous financial aid, maintaining high faculty-to-student ratios in small class sizes, and offering high-quality support services to students, which seems to be something that we are losing here at UMass. We tend to increase the number of students per class, and a whole bunch of other programs have been underfunded, basically. Clearly, to properly address the issues of low graduation rate, the university needs a budget way much higher than the actual meager $420 million. Significant investment in education at UMass is necessary in order to broaden access to higher education for students from all backgrounds and closing the opportunity gaps for immigrants, minorities, providing them a pathway to upward income mobility. Moving forward with its 20-year master plan, UMass claimed to be modernizing itself, creating its 21st century campus. But the importance of a diverse campus rooted in immigrant presence ought to underlie its development plan, for there exists a risk of sidelining immigrants as substantial increase in fees could end up being prohibitive for working class immigrants among so many other urban groups. Case in point, recent hike in parking fees. UMass Boston transformative process should not be gentrify the university itself at the expense of the working class, including immigrants and others. And another case in point, very quickly, I'll just mention CPCS. Clearly, very quickly, I'll just say that as a right, higher education, just like healthcare, should be freely and fully available to all. However, this outcome will only result from real, inclusive, and protracted fight. And in this fight, immigrants ought to be front and center with their drive for a more just, inclusive, and equitable world. Thank you.
And I'm just coming in up here, or do you want to come up here? Okay, so this is Miss Yelena Mitic-Elliott, undergraduate student here at UMass Boston, and she's going to be talking about opportunities for non-traditional students.
Thank you, Zach. I'm terribly nervous about public speaking, so it's just easier if I stand. Thank you, Professor Leslie. Everything you said, I really feel like you were speaking exactly to me because I am an immigrant. I started at UMass in 2001 as an international student, and back then I was frequenting the international student office quite often. Michael Mahan was my advisor, and he was my rock back then. But it was really hard going to school, paying international student fees, and having to work to support myself and pay through college. So I tried to do that, and about a couple of years into it, I just burnt out. So I needed to take a break. And that break lasted 13 years. So 13 years, I worked, I met my husband, I had a daughter, and then I got laid off from a job in 2015. So the logical step was to return to UMass. And the first person I went to see was Brenda Gordon, and then he was the next rock in my second time around here. So since 2015, I've been taking classes part-time. This time I was a resident student, so I was hoping that the cost of going to college would be a little bit more affordable. And I found out that that was not the case. In fact, since 2001, the cost of tuition and fees has increased by over 100%. And so now that I'm in school for the last 2 years, I've been paying the exact same tuition and fees that I was paying back in early 2000s as an international student. I am now a senior. I should be graduating this year. So, yay. Brenda Gordon told me when I was readmitted, you know, it's not a race. It's not a race. It's a marathon. So, hopefully, my marathon will be ending this year. But I am already looking for a job, even though I am in school, because I know that as soon as I get that diploma, I will be getting a bill for student loan repayment. Right now, I am over $30,000 in debt, just student loans. And from everything that we've heard today from some of the previous panelists, I actually think that puts me in pretty good shape, because in comparison to most students that have to get loans and get in debt to fund 4 years of their school, they'll be in debt over $100,000. After 4 years in school, students leave, like I said, with over $100,000 in student debt. Everywhere, student debt is on the rise, and there are studies that show that between 2004 and 2016, average student loan debt for individuals in public universities in Massachusetts rose 77%. Consistent and constant increases in fees are detracting new students from enrolling, and those that are enrolled, if they ever graduate, will face financial indebtedness that will have lifelong impact. For every $1 of debt, it takes away $4 of their individual lifetime wealth, savings, and home equity. In recent years, lots of faculty has been laid off, have not returned. Their contracts have not been renewed. From the early 2000s when I was a student here and then coming back in 2015, 16, 17, and 18 now, I see that class sizes have increased by more than 50%. Schedules and courses available have decreased. One of the reasons why I chose to come to UMass Boston and to stay here is because as a working student, as a commuting student, it's very important to have courses available in the afternoons and evenings. A lot of private colleges, in fact, I don't think any private colleges offer that. So this is the place to be. In recent years, with the expansion of the UMass Boston campus, which is well needed because, like we heard, the structure and the substructure is crumbling. We have some great new dorms. We have a great new garage. However, all of that comes at a great price, and the price is the debt that we have to take on. Right now, there are developments in the work. I recently got an email from the chancellor about the Bayside mixed economy development. And, you know, I remember some years ago hearing about a busted deal that Bob Kraft was offering to do on Bayside. That fell apart. What this new development is going to do, I'm not sure. But if it's going to create more debt and less opportunity for students, then that's not okay in my book. There's a real concern about the privatization of the institutions and their deviation from the mission. And Liz, we heard the mission of UMass Boston is its commitment to quality, public education, and inclusiveness. Those who are in charge have clearly abandoned these missions. So the question stands, and it's not about the price of the construction debt at UMass Boston. The question is, who will pay the price for the erosion of public education and its future impact on Massachusetts? My fear is that unknowingly we are already paying for it. We need to make a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Yelena. And now I'd like to introduce, do you want to sit there or come up? Okay, cool. Juan Pablo Blanco, Phenom UMass Boston and the Graduate Employees Organization here at UMass Boston.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. So yeah, I'm a graduate student here at UMass Boston. I'm a master's level student in the Transnational Cultural and Community Studies program. And I think, like, hearing about the urban mission and all what it is, like, I find myself embodied in so many of these narratives. Like, you know, I'm an immigrant, I'm a first-generation college student, first-generation graduate student. I was undocumented for 15 years. And I'm not, like, an exception at this campus, right? Like, most students may have one of those identities presented in their lives and all the kind of the barriers they present. And I think as graduate students, we are seeing these issues of underfunding, like, really, really heavily. A lot of us rely on assistantships and the tuition benefits that they come, tuition benefits that we were not given, but we fought for, luckily, because we have a union. And we've been able to mobilize ever since that was made to happen in this university. But I think as these assistantships start drying out and we're told, like, there's just no money, a lot of us, and particularly those of us that fit this urban mission description, are just not going to be able to be here anymore. We're not going to have less graduate students. We're just going to have different graduate students, which in itself is a really big issue, right? Because I think, as Tony said, like, this isn't just about more funding. It's about getting the funding and using it properly. Particularly now that just a bachelor's degree, sadly, isn't enough to have a living wage. Even sometimes with a master's degree, a living wage is still sort of a dream. Especially also when careers in higher ed are drying out. You know, the adjunctification of higher education, where a lot of us, my generation, is just not going to be able to afford to teach. And that's a huge issue, right? Particularly when the institution kind of, like, pushes us towards that. You know, things like tuition keeps going up every single year. parking fees are going up, which they claim it's necessary for our institution. But honestly, in my everyday life, in my pocket as a working student, that's another tuition hike on top of the 2.5% that we already have, right? And there's kind of like a pitting against each other. They're telling us, well, if we give staff and faculty more benefits, your tuition's going to go up. So obviously, make sure that doesn't happen. We are told you got to teach classes as graduate students, so that way we don't have to get more faculty in here. You should be administrative assistants, so we don't have to give a fully benefited staff position on campus. And I think that's what we really got to fight against, right? These narratives that are great for their own marketing, but to the existence of students, staff, and faculty on campus are literally what are shutting us out of this institution. And I think, in a way, as graduate students, we're in a place to kind of like borrow from Barbara's, what she was saying is, we're told don't raise hell, because then you won't get into the right program, you won't get the right job, you won't get the tenure, and basically all of this that you're doing, those $100,000 in debt, are just not going to do you any good. Or we're told, just wait till you're a tenured faculty person to start fighting for this. You know, I'm 30 years old right now, maybe at 55, I might forget what I'm doing this in the first place, right? No offense to 55-year-olds. And I think we really need to switch the script on this, right? Like, instead of begging for more funding, we need to demand more funding. We need to kind of co-opt that Tina, right? There is no other alternative. I kind of like that. And just tell them there is no other alternative. I think something that really makes me angry is, you know, we're in an institution where a lot of folks are really fighting for this, like, community-based research. Research that really helps the people. But then a lot of folks on campus get really uncomfortable when we're actually there and we're actually pushing the administration, the State House, whatever, you know, whatever stakeholder is responsible at that moment, because there's so many of them, it's so hard to keep track. We can't be uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. Like, again, going back to what Tony said, is we need to push and keep pushing, involve the community around us, because, you know, as Bayside gets these developments, what's it going to do? It's just going to keep pushing poor people and people of color out of Dorchester. It's going to keep pushing people like me out of this institution where I have, you know, I live in Worcester because I can't afford to live here. You could imagine what that's going to keep doing to the community around here. So I think as kind of a last ask of you is, I would just say, let's stop begging and let's start demanding. Let's really get involved in the work that's already happening at UMass Boston. We don't need to start fighting back against this, because this fight's already happening. We just need to get more people involved to the point where they can't say there is an alternative to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. You took my idea, because I was going to say, instead of there is no alternative, we need to start going to these people who are making these decisions. This is not your choice. We need to demand it, and we need to let them know they can't choose to keep doing this, because we're not going to let them. So just really quickly, I know we have to get questions in for this panel, but I really want to, since we're running a little short on time, invite Annetta up really quickly to talk about the Save UMass Boston Coalition and some of the next steps that we're taking. Over the past month, we've done a demonstration at the ribbon cutting to protest the debt. There's over $300 million in debt on this campus that shouldn't be on this campus, that everyone who goes here and works here is paying for. We protested at convocation and disrupted the faculty convocation to say we're not going to take this anymore. And we have some more stuff coming up.
Hi, everybody. So my name's Annetta Argyris. I've worked here at UMass Boston for 13 years. I'm a staff member in the Labor Resource Center. I'm also the president of the Professional Staff Union on campus and one of the co-chairs of the Save UMB Coalition. And you've heard a lot from folks this evening. It's been a full 2 hours about what we're really fighting for. Both what we're fighting for here on this campus and why UMass Boston matters to us, why how it develops and who it serves matters to us, and why public education matters to us. And you've also heard the bigger picture of what it means for how we think of our society, right, and what we want to accomplish in our society. So part of what I wanted to get up and say today to close us out, but I guess we're going to do this first and then go to questions, is it's worth fighting, right? we have something both here on this campus that's worth fighting for, and we all share a vision of a society that actually isn't full of inequity and discrimination and oppression, right? We want to fight for a society where we can all live to our greatest potential and where our resources are made available to all of us so we can accomplish that. That is worth fighting for. It's also worth fighting because we can win. This isn't out of our grasp. This isn't a vision that is inconceivable, right? We know the state has money. Representative Conley was talking about that before. We have revenues coming into the state that we should be using in different ways, and one of those ways we should be using it is ensuring that this campus exists and it exists to serve our actual communities, right? And we know we can win because people like you care about this, right? People are fed up. They're willing to begin to stand up and talk back and not accept the dictates that are handed down to us from the folks on high, right? Whether those are dictates coming from Washington, D.C., or whether those are dictates coming here on our campus. We need to raise our voices together and say, no, actually there is an alternative, and it's our vision of what we want our society to be and what we want our campus to be. So we encourage you all to get involved in our fight on this campus, and there's lots of different ways to do that. We sort of did a show of hands earlier, but who came out to Convocation? All right, so some of you who were at Convocation got to see not only the employees at the university stand up and be fed up, but a whole bunch of students spontaneously get involved and actually sit down in the aisle, continue chanting, and try to shut down Convocation until we could get an answer from President Meehan, the president of the UMass system, about what he's going to do to solve the problem here, right? And he's one of the people who has the power to address our problems here. The university system is sitting on over $300 million of unrestricted reserves. Sit with that for a minute. This is a public, nonprofit institution that's sitting on over over $100 million of unrestricted reserves. And instead of using that money to ensure that your education is affordable and that every dollar you spend in tuition goes to educate you, they're leaving that money aside and telling us to pay off the debt of building this campus, you all need to pay more in tuition and you need to pay more to park here, right? So there's something wrong with a system, a public system, that instead of using its own reserves that it's amassed to make sure education is affordable, keeps coming back to its students and employees and saying, pay more. No, pay more. You want to keep coming here? Pay more. That's the only way it's going to get funded. And we need to challenge that. So we tried to do that, take a step in that direction at Convocation when we had the president of the university system here. And we're going to continue to push. How many of you got an email from Chancellor Newman announcing the community forum that's going to happen on Monday, October 15th? All right, all you students in the audience, it's not going to show up on Snapchat. You got to check out your UMass Boston emails, all right? You should have all gotten an email inviting you to this community forum, 2 to 4 p.m., upstairs in the Lipke Auditorium right in this building. Chancellor Newman is going to be here, and we're supposed to hear about how the budget is doing, how enrollments are doing, what the future of this campus is doing. You need to be here to ask questions and to challenge them about what their priorities are. That's the only way we're going to be able to see a change in what their actions are, is if we make it clear to them that we're all not happy with what they're doing. So how many of you are going to be able to come out on Monday the 15th? Bring all your friends. Look at your calendars. Clear them so you can be upstairs from 2 to 4 p.m. to hear what they have to say and challenge what their priorities are. Ask them, why are you hiring more higher-level administrators at a time where you're telling us that the budget is so tight that you have to charge us more for parking? Why are you closing down or cutting the staffing to our centers and institutes that serve our urban communities rather than going with us to the legislature to fight for increased public funding, right? They're making decisions that are affecting all of us, and we need to challenge them. So that's one big way you can get involved. We are also going to continue to work with representatives in our legislature, reps like Rep. Conley, to figure out legislative moves. So if you sign that piece of paper that's in your folder and give us an email address through Phenom and through Save UMB, we will continue to feed information to you about how you can be involved in some of those practices as well. And there's the Save UMB Facebook page. You can tell this is not, social media is not my thing. But the Save UMB Facebook page that you should go and check out. I'm assuming you all are aware of the parking fight on campus, right? And that's going on. One of the big ways that we've been able to fight against that is because the employees on this campus are unionized. And because we're unionized, the employer has to legally bargain with us. So we've been trying to use that right that we have as unionized workers to hold back their push to increase parking fees on this campus. We have a representative from the students, a student activist who we invite to the table with us. We have graduate students who we invite to the table with us so they can hear what management has to say. And over the next month and a half, we are going to have more bargaining sessions with management, and we are going to publicize when those sessions are and invite you all to come and witness and come and spur on the administration to do the right thing and find a different way forward rather than just raising our fees, right? Rather than just trying to reach into our pockets. So that's another way that people can get involved. And if you get us your email addresses and you check out the Facebook page, you'll be able to find information about that. So that's what's happening on campus. I really hope that you guys will get involved as a planner of actions, as part of the Phenom, as part of Save UMB, or just showing up when we need to send a real clear message to the administration that they need to do things differently, and a different way forward is possible. And they need to stand with us rather than with corporate interests to make sure that this campus is doing what it should do as a public campus. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Annetta. So just very quickly again, to clarify, there's a half sheet. It says Phenom on the top. The top half is a donation. I'm guaranteed most people in the room can't make a donation. The bottom half is put your email there, and we will get emails to you about actions. In addition to coming on the 15th, if you can't be here or you're not on campus or you're working or you have kids, we need people to help with social media. We need people to help with outreach. We need people to send emails and let their friends know. There's a lot of ways to get involved. There's bargaining sessions. There's, again, as I said, emailing and the email list in our planning groups. So please fill that out. You can leave it on the back ledge as you leave or bring it up here. And now, thank you, Annetta, for taking that audible. Do we have questions for the panel that spoke just before Annetta spoke, or I guess questions for Annetta if she wants to take them? Any questions? Anyone want to take that first? Okay.
So when we were preparing this event, one of the things that I did to help spread the word was to spread posters and flyers around the campus. One of the offices I stopped by was the International Student Office and the Study Abroad Office. And the first question they asked me was, how does this concern us? And what people don't understand, or especially, international students maybe don't understand because it's not so obvious, is that these issues affect everyone who's on campus. If this university didn't exist, there would be no international students or any students of any kind. Class sizes, class schedules, availability and access to classes affects all of us. And those are some less obvious reasons. The most obvious reasons are costs. So if there's more funding for public education, then costs to international students would be lower, just as it would be lower to resident students, or completely eliminated. So that's that part, how it affects all of us. On a global, or more global question, the answer to your question, I don't think I can offer you a very good answer, but I will say this. I came from Serbia. If I had stayed and have not immigrated, I would have a college degree right now, and I wouldn't have had to pay anything for it. Serbia is, you know, in comparison to the United States, a poor country that faced many political and economic crises in the last 3 decades, and yet it still offers its students free university education. So if there are ways to maybe gap the inequality between countries, whether it's through trade or other ways, I would be the first person in line for that. So that's all I could say about that.
It seems that it's a very challenging question. I would put it that way to start with. It seems to me what's going on here in the United States now, it's like the trade war is just one component of a larger problem or larger question in itself. It seems to me that what the Trump administration is doing in general is to reinvent U.S. imperialism. It seems to me that what they think that there was a kind of a deal right after the Second World War of a certain way of leading the world with U.S. as a major power, Soviet Union being part of it a little bit, but surely certain powers in Europe. It seems to me that now the U.S. feel that they've made so many advances and so many strategic, spaces, wars and wars. Now it seems that they think, at least the Trump administration said every single day, they are totally invincible. I mean, they are spending way, way, way more than everybody else in budget, for the military. I mean, it's like you can take the whole, set of European countries, and then you take China, you take Soviet Union, you combine all those spendings that people are doing, and for arms race, and you just cannot equate U.S. money being spent on defense and so many other spaces where they do that development, military hardware, etc. But now the question is, for the Trump administration is that they've reached a point where the U.S. could think of itself able to go to war everywhere in many different places in the world and still end up being victorious in all those places. Then if it is so, then the pact that they had after World War II in their mind is no longer necessary. So now you can try to reinvent the world. And the trade war is part of that type of understanding that they have. And then for that matter, the U.S. can actually overcome all major obstacles that they thought that they had on their way, like, OMC, different type of international organization, UNESCO, or so many different international organizations. Whenever they don't do things their way, they can just bypass them and then reinvent new rules that they want to impose on the whole world. Of course, consequences would be that the type of solidarity that you would want to have to happen between countries, between people, that type of practice is undermining that, and now you're pitting people against people, the Chinese people against American people, or part of the American population against part of the Chinese population. And all of a sudden, you're going to see that thing, happening as well with the Europeans, because the Europeans already are pushing back. So then you have Europeans against part of the population of the U.S. And then all of a sudden, you have a different new world, but only U.S. imperialism being on top of it all. Now, I don't know exactly how to solve that problem, but I guess that's where people need to start thinking about what's going on now.
So as an economist, it doesn't make any economic sense or political sense. So it makes this sense, right? That's the only sense you can make of it. To target, obviously, certain countries are targeted, certain people. Okay, Mexico's okay, we'll trade with them, but not the Chinese. I think it's obvious there's a lot of racism going on. And it's stupid, except it plays to the Trump's political base, obviously. So that's why they're doing it. What we're doing, I mean, in my department, a lot of people are working on it. I want to just mention one other thing that happened, though. People had real problems getting the green cards here in Massachusetts. And we, a lot of our faculty needed to come, needed to start work in September, hadn't got the green card, delay. And we were told, frankly, because we're Massachusetts and we supported certain candidates, that the delays are longer in certain states than others. So there's obviously a lot of political things going on. And what can you do? Your work, your advocacy, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Do you want to answer, Randy, or okay? Any other questions, Joe?